Yeah, Patrick, we're here in the pub belonging to Kevin and Breed Linehan, and back in 1954, Hollywood came rolling into town to film the opening sequences of the film Moby Dick. You might like to explain how all that came about.
Right, yeah. Well, my father knew John Huston a bit, I think, from the 1920s. They'd met then. But in 1949, my father wrote a book called Beat the Devil. Mm-hmm. He and my mother comes from Mule, had come back a couple of years earlier to live here. And the novel had appeared, and then he was up staying with friends in Nuggalow in County Wicklow. It was Christmas. John Huston turned up, so he thought there was an opportunity, to get Huston to make a film out of it. And so he'd given a couple of copies of his book to friends. He had to snatch them back and throw them into Huston's car. Anyway, Huston read the book, liked the book, and he came down to stay with us in Youghal, about a mile outside Youghal. And it was he was coming into Youghal at that time, staying with us. We didn't have any telephone at that time. They'd come in for post telegrams and so forth. So that was the time that he got to know Youghal and decided that it looked a bit like New Bedford. Indeed. At the time of the whaling fleets. It was Youghal at that time. Hadn't changed much since the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. Fishing port, the quays, everything else. So he thought that New Bedford had changed and Youghal hadn't changed. So that's why he thought it would be suitable to stage Moby Dick here.
Oh, very interesting, yeah. I just barely remember myself 1954.
Yeah, no, it was great excitement.
Yeah, indeed.
And I was very small, but I remember my brother Alexander and Andrew were highly excited about it. And
were the extras or anything like that?
No. I don't know. I remember Alexander was hiding on the boat at one time, on the Pequod, while it was being made.
Sure.
So I'm not sure if he got his head up in time to be an extra, but he was there.
That's great, Patrick. That's fantastic. Thanks very much.
No, thank you.
Just had a quick word with Kevin there now about his memory. But thanks so much, Patrick. Yep.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, so Patrick, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, we're here in the pub belonging to Kevin and Breed Linehan, son and daughter-in-law of the great late Paddy Linehan and Maureen. And back in 1954, Hollywood came rolling into town to film the opening sequences of Moby Dick. And Patrick, you might like to explain to us how all that came about.
Yeah, it came about because my father knew John Huston pretty well, and Huston had made what became a cult film, Beat the Devil, out of a novel my father had written. He'd written it in 1947. He and my mother had come from England a couple of years earlier. My mother's from Youghal. Mm-hmm. My father was on the run a bit. He was a very well-known radical. That wasn't a very good thing to be in the eyes of the establishment at that time. Committee of Senator McCarthy, Committee of her Un-American Activities and so forth. But Huston wasn't intimidated by this. He and my father had known each other, I think, a bit in the 1920s. When my father wrote this book, the Christmas, it was 1949, he went up to spend Christmas with my mother in a house called Nuggalow in the Wicklow Mountains. And Huston turned up there. So my father was very keen to sell this as a film. I mean, he had no money at that time. And so he'd given a couple of copies of Beat the Devil to the people he was staying with. So he had to snatch them back, and he threw them into Huston's car. And Huston, he talked about the book to Huston before. Anyway, Huston read it and loved it and thought he'd make a movie out of it. And that happened. And was a big...
the Humphrey Bogart.
Humphrey Bogart and Gina Lodge-Bridger there, you know, so because the whole film was very heavy with stars, and it's become a sort of cult classic since. But while that was happening, when my father, he came down to stay with us at our house, Brook Lodge, which is out the Quarry Road from Youghal. He was staying there, and you know, we became closer friends with my father and mother, you know, and they had to come into Youghal a lot because there was no telephone in the house, so they had to send telegrams the whole time to Hollywood and back. You know, he very much entered into things. You had to pump water in our house at that time from the well. He and my father would be sort of pumping backwards and forwards. And I remember my brother Alexander telling me, and he said Houston looked like a sort of prophet out of the Old Testament. You know, he was pulling backwards and forwards on the pump. It's a very deep well. And but you know, he was in here a lot in Youghal, and he could see that Youghal at that time looked, you know, very much like an 18th century fishing port. You know, all the old warehouses were there, nothing much changed for 150, 200 years. And that this looked very much like New Bedford, where the sailing boats had come from. And he was going to make a film about Moby Dick. So he thought he couldn't make it in New Bedford, but he could make it in Youghal, which he knew. So that's how the Moby Dick came to be made in Youghal.
Well, fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
That's great, Patrick. Thanks.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Declan, as you probably know, was in Ireland before Patrick. He was led into Ardmore by the stone from the shore in Wales with the bell up in it. He forgot his bell that the Pope gave him when he was saying Mass in the shores of Wales. So it led him into Ardmore, reputedly. But I believe that the beauty of Ardmore that attracted Declan, mystics are always attracted by beauty. So, you know John Keats' poem, truth is beauty, beauty truth, that is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. Anyway, he arrived in Ardmore and he looked for land to build a church. And the Druids, of course, were in control. They wouldn't give many land. They said, we haven't enough land for ourselves. So the black water flowed out over at that end of the strand in those days. So Declan said, let ye all come over to Whiting Bay, he says with me. All the people of Ardmore, I'll give you all the land ye want. And they all went over with him. Now Declan said, no one is to speak a word while I carry out my magic, or miracle, I suppose you'd call it. And they said nothing. And he held up his hand and he drove back the black water until he got over there again at the end of the strand. And there was lots of reptiles and lizards and snakes and even crocodiles, I suppose, and left wriggling in the river bed when he had done it. And the young fellow in the audience got frightened and he shouted, stop, Father, you have done enough, he said. And that broke the spell. And Declan turned around and he hit him a flam of the open hand into the face. And the young fellow ran away and he ran over this way. And there was drops of blood fell out of his nose. And that's where these springs that are here today at low spring tide, you can only see them at a very low spring tide, and this is very low today. Of course, the land used to be out as far as this in those days nearly. And that's the story. The Magic Springs. St. Declan's Holy Springs, we'll call it. Like Mikey Bryan used to say, St. Declan's Blessed Well. I'll call them Holy Springs.
Yeah, and that's old Strankelly Castle there now, and the first Earl of Desmond was there in the 12th century, and any bit of land that he didn't get in his first bout of ethnic cleansing, he'd invite you to stay over and bring along a parchment showing that you actually owned the land, and they'd offer you sort of a bit of hospitality, the equivalent of Lidl's cheapest plonk. And once they got you nicely stewed, they said, look, I don't think you should be going home on a night like this, please stay over. And when you went into bed, they had a lever and they pulled the lever and it turned the bed upside down and shot you straight into the river, into the murdering hole. And beside this murdering hole, we have a lady here called Mary Sheehan who fished salmon there for how many years, Mary?
Almost 50.
Yeah, well, would you explain from beginning to end?
I will. I started fishing in 1953. The season was very bad, and the man who was fishing with my father had to leave the boat because he had a family to support, and the fish were very scarce. So there wasn't an alternative in those days. It wasn't, it was fairly poverty-stricken country, and I had to leave school and go fishing with my father. So the season turned out fairly good afterwards, and we were able to survive. But the boats we were fishing in were about 19, 20 feet long, and we had hemp nets, drift nets to fish with, and the catches were reasonably good, but they varied, of course, according to the tides and the days. It was 5 days a week, from 6 o'clock on Monday morning until Friday night at 12, and the season lasted 6 months. Started on the 1st of February and ended on the 31st of July. It was the reach, the salmon reach was from here at Old Strand Castle down as far as Youghal Bridge, and there was a lot of boats on the river, mostly timber yawls, 2 men in each boat, and in my case 1 woman and 1 man, and of course we ended up with an all-female crew, myself and my daughter Siobhan. So we had a good season, didn't we, Shiv? A couple of years we fished. The seasons, of course, they were much shorter in those days.
And Mary, just the last day we were up, we were talking about the sawmill at Ballinatray.
We were.
I can.
Hugh Murray was the man, and it was powered by a mill wheel.
That's right. Yeah.
There was a little river coming out. I can't recall the name of that little river now, and it powered the sawmill for Ballinatray House, and they used to, when it was being restored back in the old days, there was a lot of timber needed, and they got that from the estate in Ballinatray, and also then they did a little commercially afterwards and supplied the timber to build the boats, all the timber boats and stuff.
So the wheel, I think, powered it when the tide was coming in. One way, I think.
The river was flowing out towards that little river.
The actual
yeah,
it wasn't affected by the tides at all.
It wasn't. No, it actually wasn't.
Yeah.
So
that's fine.
So that was good.
Yeah. That's grand.